Oh yeah, the prop. All right. Well, thank you. You know, when Curtis asked me to speak at this event, my first reaction was, why? Why me? I'm a non-technical person. I've only been in this business 4 years. So what am I going to talk about? So he insisted. I said, I'm not sure I want to do this. He said, you must do it. So if you learn nothing today, blame him. So leading up to this, I had to think about what to talk about, and I thought that I would talk about something that led me to making this olive oil, and that's about passion and excellence. But to do so, I've got to give you a little brief background on my life, and hopefully you'll connect the dots. It might not make sense at first, but I think you'll get the point when we come to the end of it. I've had an interesting life so far. It's been very eclectic. I've done quite a few things. But I started out, I was raised by an immigrant Italian family with very little money. And we were raised on the Mediterranean diet. We had a very large garden that my father tended to and made us work in. And we had fresh vegetables all the time, and everything was obviously drizzled with olive oil. So I grew up with the flavor of olive oil. And I remember every celebration and every event, in any form of entertainment, always centered around food. So that's how I grew up, and that's the background. When I was 19, I read a book called Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I don't know if you've ever heard of that book, but it was a very inspirational book that changed my life. And basically the main theme of the book is, if you believe you can do something, you can do anything. That's basically the general theme of the book. And at that point, I realized that having grown up poor, that I wanted to be rich. So that was my number one goal at that point in my life when I was 19. And since my father had taken me to visit his firm of stockbrokers, and I had an opportunity to look around this room, not knowing what a stockbroker was, but I felt an energy in that room, and I knew somebody was making money in there. So I thought, I'm going to be a stockbroker, and having no idea what a stockbroker was. And finally talked my way into Merrill Lynch. They trained me, spent a couple years there. And I did make my first million. As I'd promised myself, I made my first million by the time I was 25. But then my attention turned to something completely different. It wasn't about making money anymore. Then I thought, I was at the small firm. I'd been hired by a very tiny, no-name firm of stockbrokers at a very early age. And with that newfound money that I just made, I decided to buy into the partnership. And all of a sudden, my goal in life became to make this tiny firm big and powerful. And I spent 16 years there doing that. And what changed everything was that one day the partners sat around and said, okay, we want to open an office in London, England, but we need a Canadian to go over there and be the branch manager. And without giving it 1 second of thought, I put my hand up and said, I'll do it. And in my mind, I thought, well, it'll be a lark. I'll go over there 6 months, make some contacts, have some fun, and come back home 6 months later. Well, getting there, I faced the cold, hard reality that nobody cared that I was there, and even less people returned my phone call. So it was much more difficult than I'd envisioned, and this theme will carry through this conversation. But the passion to build this firm was so strong that I had to stick it out, and I ended up staying there 7 years. And eventually I came up with an idea. It was a unique idea to create this thing. I won't bore you with the details, but it was called the Mining Team, and it was a group of professionals in all different disciplines of research and corporate finance and mining, whatever, and we were going to use that to do the research and create financing for mineral properties around the world. And this was at the end of the Cold War in 1990, when the world opened up, and all of a sudden there were many developing countries that were open for investment that hadn't been open for investment before. And so we created the idea of going to these countries, educating the governments about mineral law and title, and we made a business out of it. And by the time I left as chairman and CEO of the firm 16 years later, it was a very powerful boutique, and a lot of people had made a lot of money along the way. But this was at the age of 39, and I decided I wanted to retire from that business. I was no longer interested in being an investment banker. It was boring, and I'd had enough, and I'd been there too long. So I retired at 39, and I took 6 months off. And I thought, well, what am I going to do next? So I thought, well, I had been dabbling in the movie business for about 10 years prior to that, through a side investment that I'd made. I'd learned a little bit about the movie industry, just enough to be dangerous. And so I decided to create the Canadian version of an American Hollywood studio. Only it was going to be based in Canada. And this company was called Lionsgate. And I thought, you know, I was a success as an investment banker. I can do this too. What could possibly go wrong? And a lot of people told me to not do it. A lot of experts were basically saying that I was going to blow, this was not going to work out. And they were almost right. I started Lionsgate in 1997 with a lot of fanfare, and soon discovered that my inexperience created a lot of mistakes. We made a lot of mistakes along the way. We almost went bankrupt twice. I had to make payroll out of my own pocket. But I recognized that we had something very unique. We were just on the edge of this whole indie film movement. We were producing and distributing very edgy, non-mainstream films, and there was a huge market growing for that. So I thought, we can't just let this go. And a lot of people were trying to convince me to just file Chapter 11, give it up. It just wasn't working out. It was really that difficult. But I stuck it out long enough to find the right management. And once that management was in place, which took 3 years, and it was the most difficult 3 years of my life. But once that management was in place, and they're still the same managers that are there today, it has now become, you know, what is it, however many years later, 17 years later, the largest independent film studio in the world. But the only reason it stayed alive long enough was because I believed that it could be done, and I wasn't going to quit. And you know, any time that you start a new business, and you'll see, I mean, everything I've started has had difficult times, and you have to have that passion to see it through. So after Lionsgate, I ran it for 6 years, and I left, and I decided that I wanted to become an expert on gold and currencies and macroeconomics, things that I had zero education in. And so I immersed myself into reading books, and I started reading a lot of history books. I started reading a lot on politics and the financial system and banking. I would sit at home during this retired period. I would sit at home in my pajamas all day long and read. And I was just fascinated by this. And I got to the point where I thought, well, I'm going to write some articles about what I believe is happening in America today and around the world, and what's going to happen with various currencies and gold. And so I published much against the advice of some friends of mine who said, don't embarrass yourself by writing. You've never written before. Why would you start writing now? And so I published several articles that basically laid out my views of where the world was heading. And you might find it interesting, if you ever want to look something up that was published in 2003, it was called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And if you can find that article, you'll find it very, very interesting that the predictions that were made, how things played out with the Iraq War and with the dollar and, you know, the printing of money and everything that's happened to date. So what this led to was I now had a very strong belief about what was going to happen. And I made a prediction. I said, well, what am I going to do about it? So this led to a career which lasted almost 10 years of creating a number of different companies globally that were in the business of exploiting mineral deposits, oil deposits, and all sorts of commodities, because I made a call on gold and commodities. And we had a great 10-year run in probably what was the biggest bull market in commodities in the last century. And so that was a lot of fun, and we did really well. And it was all based on this very strong belief that I had that gold was going to go from 250 to a much higher number, which it did, and also oil and other commodities. During the course of all this, while I was in the middle of this, I met Bill Clinton, and we became friends. And I saw what he was doing in the HIV/AIDS area, so I decided to support him. And I funded his HIV/AIDS initiative, which really was revolutionary in terms of supplying antiretroviral drugs to the developing world. He's done an amazing job of it. So I helped him raise money for that. I put a lot of my own money into it. And I spent 2 years getting to know him. And during those 2 years watching, I saw something really interesting in him, and that a lot of people don't know. He's a very inspiring and motivational speaker. And we traveled around, and I would watch him give speeches, and I'd see the reactions of the people and how he motivated people to take action, to actually do things. And so I thought to myself, well, I can do more. I can do a lot more, you know. And so I came up with an idea, and 2 years after we met, in 2007, I came to him with an idea about creating an initiative to alleviate poverty through a sustainable method of creating jobs and raising income levels. And that was the basis of the Clinton-Giustra Enterprise Partnership, which is going full speed today. And it's great because that actually changed my life, that meeting, and I became very passionate about this venture. We've been going with this initiative now for almost 8 years, and we're now in 7 countries, and we're doing a rapid expansion now throughout Africa and Asia. And the objective is to impact in a positive way millions of lives. And that's my life goal right now. And so just by believing in what we could do, and it was just an idea, it was just a concept, and we've turned this into a very unique model now that's been deployed everywhere, and we have Fortune 500 companies that wanted to be our partners, and it's a self-sustaining way to create jobs and raise income levels. This is not charity. This is meant to be profitable. These are meant to be profitable enterprises that will be around long after we're gone. And so we're very proud of that. And it was around this time that I also decided that I was going to dedicate more of my life to philanthropy than I was to business. So at that same moment, I announced to the world that I was going to just back off from the business part of it a bit. And I joined the International Crisis Group on their board, and I became one of their chief fundraisers. And that's an organization that's based in Brussels that is meant to prevent deadly conflict around the world. It's a global organization. I founded the Street to Home Foundation in Vancouver, we had a very serious homelessness problem in Vancouver. So we organized all forms of government, the private sector and the nonprofit sector to come together with a 10-year plan to address it, and it's been very successful. And I've been part of this thing called the Boys Club Network, which is mentoring in British Columbia young boys at risk, people that don't have a lot of guidance in their lives. And I do a lot of mentoring one-on-one and within groups, and it's been really, really satisfying. So I got to this point where I started to think about my life, and I started to speak and to write about philanthropy, started to speak about wealth, the meaning of wealth, the purpose in life, charity and giving, all sorts of things. And I gave a lot of speeches on this subject, and I've written a few things on it. More recently, I started a Twitter campaign entitled Dear Rich People. You might want to look it up. And I occasionally tweet just a very brief message just to provoke thought. I want people to think about their lives. I want people to think about what the meaning to have a purposeful life. That's now turned into a monthly blog at Huffington Post, which I just launched my first article a few weeks ago. The new one's coming up tomorrow. I think you might want to look it up. It's also titled Dear Rich People. And I have plans in the works to take this message out to a much larger audience using other means. And this is all because I've now become passionate about the subject of how you live your life. How do you live your life such that when you come to the end of it, it's had meaning and purpose? So the next part of my life, and the reason we're here, is food. Now, I've been cooking my entire adult life, and unlike the speaker that preceded me, I was not trained in cooking. I did this strictly teaching myself and because I love food. And so at the age of about 24, I started to cook, and I realized I loved cooking, and I always loved to cook for large groups of people. And it's gotten to the point where I've become a fanatic about having people over and cooking for 20, 30 people at a time, getting up early in the morning, going and buying all the ingredients, planning the day, and spending the entire day in the kitchen on my own, making a great meal. And I'm teaching myself by looking at tasting the food and going, how can I make it better next time? What was wrong? If there was anything wrong with it, keeping a mental note and just experimenting. And it's been a tremendous amount of fun. And I love the idea of having people around. And this led to this oil. And this came about from a dinner we were having in Orvieto in Italy. And I'll come to that story later, because that's really how I want to end my conversation. The last thing I did, and that's just, I'll throw it in, I'm writing songs now. And, okay, well listen, so I'll tell you how it happened. Okay, so I've been writing poetry my entire life just for my own self, not for publication. I never shared it with anybody, but I've been doing it all my life. I always had an interest in writing poetry. And about 5-6 years ago, I was at an Elton John event, and I've since become a very big supporter of the Elton John Foundation, the AIDS Foundation. And he came up with an idea to auction an item which was basically, you write the lyrics, he writes the music, he records it, and he gives you the master. So I put my hand up, I bid a stupid amount of money, and I got it. And we've done it 3 times since. And on the last one, he said to me, he said, you know, you're getting pretty good at this. This isn't bad. For a guy who's never done this before. So I thought, wow, Elton John told me I can write songs. And so I started to write for other artists and for other purposes. And now I have a music studio. I work with 3 composer producers, and I spend 3-4 hours a day locked up in that studio, losing myself in the process of songwriting. One of my songs was on Sarah McLachlan's last album, Shine On, which is the lullaby called Little Bee, and you'll want to play this for your children. It'll make you cry and them cry. It's a very, very special song. And I promise you that, we're only a year into having this music studio, but I promise you, we're working with all these artists now. We've been writing, producing, probably written 60 songs. We'll produce a hit. I assure you, out of this process will come 1 or 2 hits, and I promise you it's going to happen. I can just see it, I can smell it, I can see the enthusiasm, I can see the quality of these songs, and it's just because I love it, and I love losing myself in that studio. So I guess coming to the point now, okay, it's everything in my life, and the success of this oil is about passion. And passion will get you through the very difficult times, as we all have in this business, because passion gives you conviction. And when you have conviction, you stay in the game no matter how hard it gets. More importantly, passion sells. It sells to your employees. Like Cesare Banchini, who runs this organization, is as passionate, if not more passionate, than I am about the other. He lives and breathes, and when you talk to him, you see that he oozes passion for what he's doing. So you can sell your passion to your customers, to your employees, because people will smell when they see that you really believe in it. They want to be part of it. But I think that the most important part of passion is that passion begets excellence. Because once you're passionate about something, you're going to work your butt off to make that the best that it can possibly be. And when we took this oil, it was we tasted it, and I knew nothing about oil, like zero about oil. But I started asking a lot of questions, and I started to learn about the things that were mentioned in the video, about the elements that destroy oil. So I said, well, let's get into the olive oil business. After we did a few taste testings and I convinced myself that this was quite special, I said, let's take all of the elements out of this thing. Let's just spend a lot of money and a lot of time to make the best olive oil in the world. And I started to tell people that we were going to make the best olive oil in the world. Now, I know that's a very subjective statement because, how do you say what's the best olive oil in the world? You can't, but that's not the point. I believe that. I believed we were going to make the best olive oil in the world. And the last couple of years, we've won top awards here at this competition and other competitions. And what's interesting now is that I've got people coming up to me saying that they believe it's the best olive oil in the world. So it's contagious. Passion is contagious. And I think that if you take anything from this talk, it's that, listen, we've got a problem in our industry, okay? The problem that we have us quality producers have in our industry is that we're competing in a very crowded marketplace against low-priced, very low quality, and sometimes fraudulent oil. And it's impossible to cater to a largely unsophisticated audience of buyers and price your product accordingly to what it deserves to be priced at. So a lot of us, including me, lose money. I'm losing money in this business at the moment. And hopefully there's a way out of this. But I'm staying in it because I know we've got one of the best oils in the world. But so I think that collectively as olive oil producers, what we have to do is not just sell the oil. And I know I was listening to the presentation by Rob this morning, and he's absolutely right. I think one of the biggest things we have to do is educate the audience, educate our customers. Because I think once they are educated and understand all the benefits of olive oil, they will naturally be interested in it. But I think more importantly than that, and this is the part, is don't sell oil, sell the story. a friend of mine, Peter Guber, wrote a book called Tell It to Win. I don't know if anybody's read that book. It's an amazing book that talks about selling by telling stories, not by talking about statistics and facts and figures. That's really boring. People don't want to hear about that. What people want to hear about is the idea of oil. That oil is, when I talk about oil, I say, I take this oil, and when I make this dish, I drizzle it on, and it's just amazing, the flavor in the soup and in the meats. And I describe in detail, I make it sound better than sex. And so what happens is that at the end of the day, they get involved in your story. They want to be part of it. So I think that really, just to summarize it, I just think passion is important, and storytelling is important, and passion translates to excellence, and hopefully excellence will translate to success. And thank you very much for your time.